Good day to Dr. Hamida and friends who are tuning in. For this task 3 of Kaedah Penyelidikan 1, our group will be presenting on Quasi-Experimental Research Design. Our group members are Song Senja, me, Ooi Wei Zhuang, followed by Lavanya, Vejayan, and Norlisa Binti Abdullah. This is the presentation outline. So I, Ooi Wei Zhuang, will be presenting on definitions and characteristics, research objectives, questions or hypotheses for quasi-experimental design, followed by Song Senja, who will be presenting on research samples and sampling, then Lavanya Vejayan on research instruments, and lastly, Norlisa Binti Abdullah on research data analysis. So, what is quasi-experimental research design? Quasi means resembling. Quasi-experimental research refers to a research that resembles experimental research, but it is not a true experimental research. It is somewhere between correlational studies, which is a non-experimental research method, and true experiments. Quasi-experiments usually test causal relationships in situations. It is usually conducted to evaluate the effectiveness of a treatment or intervention. Quasi-experiments is widely accepted in social sciences, but it is not reliable and unscientific in the physical and biological sciences. As for the characteristics of quasi-experimental research design, this research is usually used in special situations or when conditions and experiences of the identified research participants lack some control. This can be seen in studies that do not have random assignment in their sampling, that consist of pre-existing factors such as variables that cannot and is not manipulated, or when a study excludes a comparison or control group. The need to deliberately leave out one of the key components of a traditional experiment or true experiment could be for ethical or methodological reasons. For example, it would be unethical to withhold a treatment from a control group, and this is usually the case in life-threatening illnesses such as cancer, or when a regular experiment might be too expensive and impossible to carry out. Next, an experiment that has a high percentage in failing due to loss of participants over time. And last example would be, it might be logistically impossible to control all variables like a regular experiment. Next, for quasi-experimental research design, participants are not randomly assigned to conditions or orders of conditions in research. Therefore, it does not eliminate the problem of confounding variables. These variables refer to variables that cannot be controlled or be eliminated by the researcher. As a result, this introduces more threats to the internal validity of a research as compared to true experiments. The threats to internal validity of a quasi-experimental research include maturation, where individuals develop or change during the experiment over time, such as becoming older, wiser, stronger, and more experienced. Second threat to internal validity would be selection bias, where groups are not equivalent at the beginning of the experiment in regards to the dependent variable. Third threat to internal validity would be mortality, where participants fail to participate through the entirety of the experiment. Lastly, interaction of selection with the threats mentioned above. In continuation of research design characteristics, the independent variable found in quasi-experimental research is manipulated, which can eliminate the directionality problem, where a situation with two variables in which the cause and effect is not known or unidentifiable. There are many ways to carry out quasi-experimental research. Four categories of quasi-experimental research designs are one-group designs, non-equivalent control group designs, time series designs, and developmental designs. In each of these designs, there are many types of quasi-experimental research, which will be explained later on. In quasi-experimental research, the research objectives must be written, as well as the research questions or research hypotheses. In general, quasi-experimental research adheres to the conventions of writing and reporting a quantitative research. So, research objectives are written statements that specify goals the researcher plans to achieve in a study. For research questions, it describes the participants' reactions to a single variable, compare groups on an outcome, or relate two variables. There are three types of research questions that can be written, which are descriptive questions, relationship questions, and comparison questions. In quasi-experimental research, hypotheses are included as predictions to be tested about the outcome of a relationship among attributes or characteristics. Hypotheses consist of null hypothesis and alternative hypothesis. For null hypothesis, it is to test in the general population that there is no change, no relationship, and no difference. While alternative hypothesis refers to a hypothesis that may be tested true if the null hypothesis is rejected. It will suggest a change, a relationship, or a difference. Furthermore, Massachusetts 2020 recommends that in quasi-experimental research, it should include one primary objective and corresponding hypothesis, with four identified elements written in it, which are P for population, I for intervention, C for control or comparison group, and O for outcome, followed by secondary objectives and hypotheses in limited numbers, which may involve different secondary outcomes or planned subgroup analysis. Here are some examples of research objectives and hypotheses in a quasi-experimental research. Here's a study by Mamafik, Alia Nadira, Manian 2020, titled A Quasi-Experiment on Using Guided Mobile Learning Interventions in ESL Classroom, Time Use, and Academic Performance. The research objectives refer to A, the primary objective, to test the intervention so that it can increase language learning performance. 1B refers to a secondary objective, to test another independent variable in the study on language learning performance. Whereas the hypothesis presented are alternative hypotheses that corresponds to the primary and secondary objective. The first being predicting treatment group having better language learning performance than the control group. The second hypothesis predicts that treatment group students who spend more time on the intervention approach having better overall performance. The last examples of quasi-experimental research questions and hypotheses can be demonstrated in a study by Shi 2017. In his or her research questions, 1A refers to a primary research question, a comparison question that attempts to identify differences in vocabulary ability between a treatment and a control group. 1B is a secondary research question, which is a descriptive question that attempts to identify participants' responses to the independent variable referring to different teaching methods. Next, three hypotheses has been written in correspondence to the first research question, 1A. So a null hypothesis is written to show that there is no differences between the two groups' vocabulary ability. 2B and 2C refers to alternative hypothesis. H1 is a prediction where the treatment group will have better vocabulary ability. H2 refers to the control group having better vocabulary ability.
Hello Professor, I'm Song. Moving on to the next topic, research samples and sampling. So according to Kurzweil, a quasi-experimental study is a type of non-randomized intervention study because the groups for a quasi-experiment cannot be formed artificially. So researchers use a kind of sampling method called purposive sampling. In this purposive sampling, which is also known as judgmental samplings, the researchers will deliberately select specific settings, persons, or events as samples for the study to gain the information that they want. So, the following table will show a list of existing quasi-experimental designs and their sampling characteristics. In the table here, we can see a list of quasi-experimental designs with respective descriptions and the key limitations for their sampling method. For one group post-test only, one group pre-test post-test, basic time series design, interrupted time series design, we can notice that they do not use control group for comparisons, while the rest, non-equivalent control group post-test only, non-equivalent control group pre-test post-test, and control series design, they do not have random assignment between groups. In general, comparison groups are mostly used in a quasi-experimental study. After seeing the list of quasi-experimental studies, now we will learn how does a quasi-experimental approach usually work with control or comparison group. There are a total of 5 steps taken by researchers usually. First, they will identify the nature of an intervention, target population groups, and objectives, and then they will select a data collection or analysis methodology and a set of indicators that shows the desired change. After that, they will choose a sample of units from the target population to form an intervention group and a comparison group. Using the same methodology as the baseline, they will then carry out a second round of data collections after the intervention has partially or fully completed. Finally, they will compare the results across the 2 different groups and then attribute the difference to the intervention. However, when conducting a quasi-experimental study, there's always one main potential challenge of a quasi-experiment research, which is how can they diminish or hinder from the selection bias? Why do we call it a selection bias? This is because the results between intervention group and comparison group may be different due to the systematic differences, or we call it as inhomogeneity. This systematic difference will influence a measurement accuracy. Thus, it raises a need for the researchers to form valid comparisons. So in general, there are 4 mostly used techniques to form a genuine comparison group. The first technique is non-equivalent group designs. These NEGD designs mainly help to determine comparison groups that are highly similar to the target population. Even before the development intervention, these comparison groups should have already existed. For instance, let's say in an intervention group, students in a school or classroom are chosen, and these samples must be from a target population. So when choosing a comparison group for NEGD, students from a similar school or classroom are selected, but these similar individuals are not from target populations. Nevertheless, NEGD has some disadvantages also. First, it is hardly possible for the researchers to create an absolutely similar intervention or comparison group. This will directly lead to a lesser reliability of NEGD. And then, NEGD also needs more precise understandings compared with randomized controlled trials intervention. So let's see what is RCT. Basically, it is an intervention which the control group and the intervention group are chosen randomly from the eligible population. Back to NEGD, because of the differences in early stage, it may cause or influence the results later. Therefore, because of this, studies based on NEGD almost always consist of a baseline and follow-up, so that the differences at baseline and the differences during or after an intervention can be assessed. Moving on to the next technique, propensity score matching. The researchers use this method when a comparison group is chosen only after the data is collected. And these individual units who have not received an intervention are directly matched with those who have in PSM. Let's see from examples. In this intervention group, a household of a husband and wife, aged 40 until 50, with 2 daughters and owns 3 cats, is chosen. So when coming to the comparison group, after the intervention group has received the intervention, then only comparison group will be decided. So a household with exact similar average characteristic is selected. Because knowing perfect matching is almost impossible, PSM, a set of statistical techniques, is used instead to form a comparison group. So to make sure that the average characteristics of the intervention and comparison groups are mostly identical. Hence, the results will not be deemed biased. To have an overview, these are the 5 steps that researchers usually carry out to conduct PSM. First, ensure representativeness. Second, estimate propensity score. Third, select a matching algorithm. 4, check for balance. And last, estimate program effects and explain the results. The next technique used is regression discontinuity design, RDD. So in this technique, the target population is chosen after reaching a certain criteria or observed variable, which we call it as a threshold or a cutoff point. So these variables can be age, income, or score, for example. RDD decides the eligibility of one to participate in the study. After choosing, causal inference will then be made to differentiate the individuals on both sides of the threshold. The advantage of RDD is researchers are able to differentiate the people who lie above or below threshold immediately to find out the effects of a program based on the gain outcomes. For more detailed examples, if people only qualify for a specific exam, if they are earning less than 1,000 a month, or have a body mass index BMI of less than 16. So this can be the threshold of cutoff point for a study. Finally, the last technique used for the researchers to create a valid comparison in quasi-experiment is reflexive comparisons. In reflexive comparisons, comparison group does not exist, but the intervention group itself acts as their own comparisons. So with the same sets of unit, a pre and post test, which we call also as baseline and repeat study, is carried out. Then the change between the two goes to the project intervention attributions. Let's see an example given by Banerjee and Duflo. So this is how it's said. So in a project, there's this project looking for how to improve farmers' crop use. So they have chosen a sample of the farmers for the pre-test. However, because of this farmer, they did not receive any inputs at the beginning, so it makes them eligible to be the comparison group itself afterwards. For this kind of technique, many baseline and follow-up studies are used to assess the change. However, there's one drawback of this technique, which is the changes caused by an intervention and the changes due to other effects may be confused and cannot be identified. So, there's a possibility of unexpected variable that might influence the results throughout the pre-test and post-test studies.
Thank you. Good day, Doctor. I'm Lavanya and I will be taking over. For my part, we will be looking at research instruments. So, what are some of the research instruments used? There are four commonly used instruments. Firstly, observations. This is conducted by a non-participant and this is to avoid bias. The researcher observes the participant and takes down notes either using a checklist or just a field note. Next, interviews and focus groups. Interviews can be conducted individually or in groups. The questions are semi-structured to allow researcher to probe further to get a better understanding. So, if there is something that the researcher does not understand or the information given by the participant is not sufficient, the researcher can probe further to get a better answer from the participant. Next, administration of test. Tests are carried out in the beginning and at the end of the research. The scores are compared and a descriptive statistical analysis is carried out to obtain the result. There are also instances where tests are constantly done to compare the effectiveness of intervention. Finally, questionnaires. Questionnaires have close-ended questions and are mostly constructed using the 5-point Likert scale. Next, we will move to some pre-test and post-test materials for treatment. These samples are quasi-experimental studies in infectious diseases. The first sample is the one-group pre-test post-test design. In this design, one pre-test is conducted, then an intervention is implemented, and then the post-test is carried out to obtain the result. So O1 post-test, X intervention, O2 post-test. So an example from the sample is O1, the acquisition rate of VRE as determined by the results of perirectal surveillance culture. X, the uh, the intervention, the introduction of the use of alcohol-based disinfectant, and O2, the acquisition rate of VRE after the intervention. So we can say that the inclusion of the pre-test, it provides an information about what the rate could be if the intervention was not carried out. Moving on to the second sample. The second sample is also the acquisition of VRE, right? The one group pre-test post-test design that uses a double pre-test. So in easier words, two pre-tests is conducted before an intervention is introduced and then the post-test is taken. So the advantage of this is that since there are two pre-tests, it reduces the possibility of regression to the mean maturation or seasonality that you could see between the intervention and the post-test result. So the example of this is a study which used an alcohol-based hand disinfectant led to lower VRE acquisition rate. Here, O3 is the post-test, O2 and O1 is the pre-test. So the results show that O3 is lesser than O2 and O1. So if one pre-test has two pre-intervention, so they and the both of it is elevated, it would suggest that if there is a decrease in the result in the post-test, it is not probably due to the confounding variable or due to the maturation effect or to the seasonal effect or the regression to the mean. It could just mean that the intervention was working better. Next, also the same sample, the one group pre-test post-test design that uses a non-equivalent dependent variable. This design involves the inclusion of non-equivalent dependent variable B in addition to the primary dependent variable A. So variable A and B should have similar construct, and it should measure a similar potential causal variable and confounding variable, except for the effect of intervention, which means uh, your pre-test would have two variables and the post-test would have two variables. So we would look at the example, taking our VAP as an example. Variable A could be the incidence of VAP, and variable B could be the incidence of a catheter associated UTI. If an educational intervention is aimed at encouraging hospital staff to raise the head of patient's bed and to follow a mechanical ventilation weaning protocol, we would expect that the observation would decrease the incidence of VAP, but it would not decrease the incidence of UTI. But the number of important confounding variables, um, such as the severity of illness and the antibiotic prescribing practice, and this might affect the outcome of the measurement. So if VAP and UTI rates are both measured and the VPA rate decrease after the intervention, but the UTI rate does not, it just shows that the data is more convincing. So after looking at all these three samples, we can see that the instruments used are mostly observation and post-test and pre-test. So since the researchers here are doctors, so we could say that the practitioners, they observed their patients, their participants, to obtain their pre-test result and also to obtain their post-test result. And um, these results that they have gathered, it would be tabulated and it would be later analyzed using a statistical, a descriptive statistical method. So moving on, the threats of internal validity. So one, the state of measurement of different dependent variable across the group of respondents, and it exists because of the low reliability method, and it also happens due to the measurements made under different conditions, different time, or even using different instruments. And how we can reduce it is we can use a more subjective instrument, or we could use a blind rater. A blind rater is basically someone who is not involved in the research, so they would not have a biased opinion towards what's happening. Or we could also balance the measurement condition, or we could perform a concurrent measurement for different group of respondent, or we could just build different and inconsistent tests. Like for example, um, a situation in school. So when the teacher carries out the pre-test, maybe the questions could be fill in the blanks. And after an intervention is introduced, for the post-test, maybe the method of the test could be a little different, maybe a quiz, or maybe a circle the correct answer. So this would help to reduce it, right? So that is all from me. I'll pass over to my.
Okay, Assalamualaikum, Prof. Hamida. My name is Norlisa Binti Abdullah. I will now continue with the quasi-experimental methods for data analysis. Okay, there are three types of quasi-experimental methods for data analysis that I will mention today. The first one is called the single difference impact estimates. Alright, it compares the outcomes in the treatment group with the outcomes in the comparison group at a single point in time following the intervention. Alright, the second one is the difference in differences. Okay, it is also known as the double difference or the DID, which compares the changes in outcome over time between treatment and comparison groups to estimate impact. Okay, DID gives a stronger impact estimate than single difference, which only compares the difference in outcomes between treatment and comparison groups following the intervention. Okay, this double difference estimate is also greater than the single difference estimate. Okay, the third one is the regression methods of estimating single and double difference impact estimate. Okay, the single and double difference impact estimates may also be estimated using ordinary least squares regression. This approach is applied to the same matched data, including a program or policy dummy variable on the right-hand side of the regression equation. The variables that capture other confounding factors can also be included on the right-hand side to eliminate the remaining effect of any discrepancies in these variables between treatment and comparison areas on the outcomes after matching. Okay, moving on. Okay, I will continue with how the data collected analyzed. Okay, using the inferential statistics or the statistical package for the social science SPSS software. Okay, I will talk about the first quasi-experimental design, which is the non-equivalent group pre-test and post-test. Okay, there are two groups of respondents. Okay, the treatment and the control groups, and both groups are measured twice with the pre-test and post-test. Okay, the data can be analyzed using the split plot ANOVA or SPANOVA test. Okay, its purpose is to determine the effectiveness of the treatment, okay, by Chua 2012. It is also an alternative to a completely randomized design, okay, by Salkind 2010. Okay, moving on. Okay, the next type of quasi-experimental design is the regression discontinuity design. Alright, this design is used to study a special group within an organization. Alright, next, the strength of this design is that it only requires treatment to be given to groups which really need it. Okay, for data analysis, okay, it is the independent t-test is used, okay, to analyze the difference between the scores of each group, okay, by Chua 2012. Okay, as an example, okay, if there is a significant difference between the pre-test and post-test scores for the weak group, and no significant difference between the pre-test and post-test scores for the skilled group, thus the researcher will report that significantly there is a treatment effect. Okay, the third one is the time series design. Okay, there are two types of time series design. The first one is the temporarily interrupted time series design. The second one is the permanently interrupted time series design. Okay, so for the data analysis method, alright, the time series analysis or the SPANOVA test is used for this type of design. Okay, it is a special method, alright, which is also known as a time series analysis. Okay, which sees how a variable change over time, and it is also to examine how the changes associated with the chosen date point compares to shifts in other variables over the same time period. Okay, by Kenton and Scott, 2020. Okay, the purpose is to determine, okay, whether the difference between the treatment and the control group is significant. Okay, finally, I'll move on to the examples of the quasi-experimental studies in some, I'll give an example about the data analysis used in some existing studies. Okay, the first quasi-experimental study, the title is The Effect of Fun Learning Enrichment Program, FLEP on at-risk students' motivation and aspiration to learn. Okay, this focuses on the low-achieving students. Okay, so learning is to be made fun, okay, through the FLEP program. Okay, for this research, the data analysis used, okay, in this quasi-experimental study, okay, a pilot study was carried out. So alpha chrombat test was carried out. Okay, for the descriptive statistics, okay, the mean and standard deviation was used. All right, and then for the inferential statistics, the independent sample t-test and paired sample t-test was used in this study. Okay, this study was by Ishaq et al. 2019. Okay, and then finally, the second one and the last one is, the title of the research is Enhancing ESL Learners' Writing Skills via ProvWrite, okay, which is also a platform, an online platform which is learning through a game, okay, where students learn writing skills. Okay, so in this study, the data analysis study used the descriptive statistics, okay, where they used the mean to make a comparison between the pre-test and the post-test, and also inferential statistics, where the paired two sample t-test is used, which is to identify the differences between of the means for the pre-test and post-test. Okay, so that is the end of our presentation. Okay, so for our references, we have used around 20 references for this group work. Okay, we have used the UKM Gaia UKM format. Okay, so that is all from us. Thank you very much. Thank you for listening. Bye.